There was a pandemic with social distancing and mask wearing. There were protests in the street with people being beaten and arrested and thrown in jail. There was racial tension. There was high unemployment. There was a general repudiation of the conservative administration. There was new technology to spread information, and there was an invigorated interest to change the country politically. The stage was set for a major turning point in the history of the United States. I know, it sounds all too familiar, but this was not 2020. This was 1920, a pivotal moment in the history of our country. With the passage of the 19th Amendment, women finally won the right to vote. But it was a long and difficult journey.
Welcome. Make yourselves comfortable, because I have a riddle for you. When is a citizen not a citizen? When she's a woman, of course. I called that the Suffrage Conundrum back in 1912. That's when I was the leader of the La Crosse Equal Suffrage League. And knowing that the pen is mightier than the sword, I started a year-long letter-writing campaign to the local paper. You see, I'm from the East Coast, where the suffrage movement has been going strong for years. And so I got here and I saw they needed my help. I've always felt it was my duty to educate people, mostly men, on the great strides that women had been taking toward the right to vote. Back east, we paid close attention to the suffrage movement in England. They knew how to ruffle feathers there. And I thought, well, we needed to ruffle some feathers here, too. So we got together. We made plans. We had meetings. We put up notices, wrote letters, took out ads in the paper, organized parades, scheduled lectures. We worked hard for everything, especially donations. You never see men holding a bake sale, do you? But then, on a July 4th outing, I saw a prime opportunity for some public speaking on women's right to vote, and it would cost nothing. Later, this is what I wrote to the paper. While wandering around the Copeland Park on the birthday of American independence, in company with a large crowd of humanity, all looking, listening, and apparently desiring some form of entertainment to help pass away the time, it occurred to the writer what a fine opportunity was presented for some equal suffrage speaker to corral a crowd of these men and women and tell them some things that they did not know on that question. Some would have listened through interest, some through curiosity, and some with animosity. But no matter what the motive, just so they listened. At any rate, it would have given food for thought. But now, there are some people, mostly men, who have these ridiculous ideas of why women shouldn't have the right to vote. I've always said that our elected officials would be more likely to listen to and act on women's issues if women had a voice at the ballot box. We need women's voices to make a well-balanced democratic government. And so in August, I wrote this. It seems to be the fact that women and men often look at the same subject in different ways. As most subjects have two sides, it is another reason why they should work together to make well-balanced laws for all concerned. No disenfranchised class could be safe. Now, over the previous decades, laws have been changed because women made their voices heard. I certainly remember, and I'm sure you do too, when women and young girls worked 12-hour days in factories. But it was brave women like Frances Perkins, who got that law changed. I said this, too, to the editor. Women deserve credit for the reform laws, many of the reform laws which have been adopted in this country. Women's vote will be for the common good. In October, a month later, I wrote, votes for women must not be lost in the political scuffle which is going on so fiercely at this time. Women have been playing the game of politics with men for 50 years, but without the ballot, which men prize so highly. The right of petition is too slow, and men themselves would not endure it for a day. Why should women be compelled to accept it? Will politics be a hardship for women? No. Women are used to hardships. Women are not the ones who shrink the most in the hard game of life. And why is it that the only class of women who is asked to stay home are the class that have come on the stage of action, asking for a better state of things? Well, the November 1912 election came and went, and once again, the voters, obviously men, seemed unconcerned about giving women the right to vote. But we weren't finished yet, not by a long shot. For instance, the next November, 1913, I accompanied my good friend Florence Bunting. You know Florence. She was the president of the La Crosse Women's Suffrage Association. You remember Florence. Well, Florence and I went to Madison to represent La Crosse at the 23rd Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association meeting. And the next April, the Suffrage Club here got together to plan and celebrate May 2nd as Suffrage Day. Not only would we have a parade, but also a full page of suffrage news in the La Crosse Tribune, all edited by women. I was in charge of circulating a petition for the amendment to the Constitution giving women the right to vote. The march continued on. But I'll leave you with one of my favorite letters from February 29th, 1912. I think it gives you a good perspective of how far we've come and, well, how far we still have to go. Women should remember that there was a time when married women could not hold and enjoy their own property. Their husbands could take and use their personal property as soon as he could reduce it to possession. And the husband was entitled to hold all his wife's land and tenements and to have and use all the income and profits himself, and his wife could not say him nay. The wife was a mere chattel in her husband's household and entirely dependent upon him for her personal needs. But by the agitation of brave and noble women, this is now all changed. Women should be mindful of the advantages that have come to them by the onward march of progress. But they should not feel that all has been done. New needs arise every day that call for the votes of women. Well, you've heard what I have to say. Well, some of it anyway, because I have lots more. But you do have other women to listen to. And then there's this one man, but believe me, pay him no mind. Thank you very much for coming.
To get a better picture of the fight for women's voting rights, we need to go back almost a century earlier. During the first decades of 19th century America, the anti-slavery movement was gaining ground. Men and women joined forces to abolish slavery, and the abolitionist groups gave birth to the women's rights groups. Soon they were making headlines, especially in New England. In July of 1848, a small town in New York called Seneca Falls was host to 300 women and men arguing for women's suffrage, or voting rights. Elizabeth Cady Stanton read out a list she called the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled after the Declaration of Independence, whose line, "All men are created equal," neglected to include, in reality, the actual all. 100 of the Seneca Falls attendees signed the Declaration of Sentiments, and the modern women's voting rights movement was underway. For the next decade, women's suffrage gained support, members, and traction. But in 1861, the Civil War put an end to any major influence or coverage. Abolition of slavery was now on the front lines. The passage of the 13th Amendment in 1863 freed the slaves, but the war continued for another 2 years. The South's surrender in April of 1865 brought a new hope for the country's future, but the optimism was derailed by Lincoln's assassination and Reconstruction. Women's suffrage had taken a back seat for almost another decade, but by 1870 it was ramping up again. Elizabeth Cady Stanton emerged as its leader, and she began fiercely campaigning for a women's amendment. On November 26, 1869, Elizabeth Cady Stanton came to La Crosse to give a lecture on women's suffrage. As a local newspaper put it,
"This lady, who proposes to reverse matters a little and give the ladies a chance to carve the steak, while the gentlemen mind the teapot, will tell us all about it at Pomeroy Opera Hall Friday evening. We expect a rare intellectual treat, with an opportunity of listening to one of the eminent women of the age. What she says will be said decently and in order, and in her opinions, whether we agree with them or not, will, at the very least, be entitled to respect."
The following day it was reported that an unusually large and intelligent audience listened with the closest and most respectful attention to her talk on women's rights. The article, however, revealed that the newspaper editors did not particularly support Stanton's views, but
We felt that she was in earnest and endeavored to understand her and excuse her when she went too far.
it is unknown if the newspaper reported that Stanton's lecture in La Crosse was sponsored by the Young Men's Library Association. But their reaction was a prime example of the ingrained patriarchy of the time. Following the Civil War, women's voices for change became louder and more united. 5 years after the end of slavery, the 14th Amendment gave black men the right to vote. That same year, 1868, women's suffrage legislation was introduced in Congress for the first time, without success. In 1870, the 15th Amendment stated that the right to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude, but failed to include any mention of gender. Enter Susan B. Anthony, a tireless voice for women and a good friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Anthony quickly learned from Stanton and developed the necessary energy, stamina, and confidence. In 1872, Anthony illegally registered and voted in the presidential election. She was arrested, tried, and convicted, but refused to pay the $100 fine and gave a speech in court that was deemed one of the greatest of the suffrage movement. In 1876, she led the disruption of the United States centennial celebration at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, seizing the moment to read the Declaration of Rights for Women. Within the next decade, a group of women in La Crosse formed a women's suffrage club, and in 1886, they invited Susan B. Anthony to come and speak.
Well, hello! It's wonderful to see new faces. A new class of students who appreciate learning. My name is Layla Woodman Usher. And in 1859, I was born on a family farm just north of here in Onalaska. My mother, the former Susanna Coffin Woodman, was quietly strong. And I saw that my father, Isaac Lane Usher, supported her independent thinking. Both my parents saw my talent in art at an early age, and I pursued that later. But in those early years in La Crosse, my passion was for the women's suffrage movement. I believed that women needed to be independent. One of the early feminists said, her name was Madame de Staël. She said, ought not every woman, like every man, follow the bent of her own talents? By the time I was 22 years old, I was writing letters about the women's suffrage movement to local newspapers. These letters held the essence of my beliefs. I wanted women to support each other in all respects. I wanted them to pursue their freedoms. I'll read a few words from one of my letters. Nothing short of independence can develop character in woman or man. A more enlightened public will, in time, recognize that it is a woman's duty to make the most of herself in private life and public interest. And then, in 1885, I organized the first women's suffragette club here in La Crosse. And we brought Susan B. Anthony to this city. What an honor it was to be in her presence. Her words were truly inspirational. And I found out about that time that there were great goings on in the women's suffrage movement out on the East Coast. So I packed my bags and I took off for Cambridge, Massachusetts. I became an art teacher in the public schools. And it was that time that I was particularly drawn to the art of sculpturing. I loved the feel of the clay and the images that I could create with it. But I continued to support the women's movement by writing letters back to Milwaukee newspapers and La Crosse newspapers. I stated, women's duty is a progressive issue. The duty of the woman of one generation may not be the duty of the woman of the succeeding generation. Ideas should change with changing conditions if they are to meet the wants of a new and progressive age. And then new doors began to open up to me. I went to Paris and I went to Rome. I wanted to study with the European masters. I wanted to stay on top of my technique. I continued to write. I wrote articles about artists and I submitted them to the New England magazine. But then, in 1902, I was commissioned to create a bronze image of Booker T. Washington for the Tuskegee Institute. And others followed. I made another one for Major John Wesley Powell, who was a Civil War veteran, a geologist, and an explorer. And that was installed in the Grand Canyon. Then the writer, Walt Whitman, and then Susan B. Anthony herself. My art has been displayed at Harvard, Bryn Mawr, Johns Hopkins, the St. Louis Fair, and world exhibitions in Omaha, in Atlanta. I have had a long and memorable life. I lived to be almost 96 years of age. I died 2 weeks before my birthday in 1955. and I am buried in New York City. But when I heard about these goings on here at the cemetery, I just decided to spirit myself this way. And it has been a blessing to reconnect with the beautiful land of my birth and to visit the gravesite of my brother, Ellis Usher. I am proud of many of the accomplishments I made in my life. But it was those early days in the women's suffrage movement here in La Crosse that are most dear to my heart. What a day it was when we finally won the right to vote. It was long overdue. So I call out to you. Exercise your right to vote at the upcoming election. Share your voice. It is our duty to vote. I must get back to my work, so class dismissed.
Accompanying Susan B. Anthony to La Crosse in 1886 was Olympia Brown, a Universalist minister based in Racine. Brown was one of the first women ordained as a church leader, but she was also devoted to women's rights and suffrage. Olympia, one of the first-generation suffragists, was born in 1835 and lived to see the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Both Anthony and Brown were passionate about the urgent need to organize and to improve the conditions of many, including poor working women and other disenfranchised people. Following their visit, the La Crosse branch of the Suffrage Association was established. Opposition to women's suffrage was widespread in the United States during the suffrage movement. Even respected scientists and social leaders of the time believed that giving women the right to vote would cause a complete and utter breakdown of societal norms. In 1871, the Anti-Suffrage Party was born. Those against women's suffrage included religious leaders, businessmen, brewery and tavern owners due to the temperance issues, many politicians, and of course, some husbands. But men were not the only ones who fought women's right to vote. Some women, mostly of higher social class, were worried about these same societal disruptions. They were afraid of losing what they saw as their own positions of leadership. These women had a voice through their marital connections, financial status, or family histories, yet enjoyed the societal security of their gender. At the heart of the anti-suffrage argument was the basic natural family unit. Men were the breadwinners and head of the family. Women had children and kept the home. What would happen if women were allowed to vote?
Talking about getting a vote. Well, I've been listening to them too. I've been taking notes. Matter of fact, I got them right here. I don't want to miss something because you need to hear the other side of this. This is not a good thing. You know, we got to agree that our founders were pretty smart when it came to making laws. And if you remember, when they did the Constitution, did they let women vote? No, they did not. They knew back then, like we know now, women were too emotional and too sensitive to really make good judgment about voting. And also, they were easily, they would take other people's opinion all the time, change their minds. Well, look at the way they follow fashion. You know, they got to have different shoes all the time, and they got to have different clothes all the time, and they wear those silly hats they can't even keep them on their heads. nonsense. Why, a man could wear the same clothes all week long and be perfectly happy. So here we are, all this voting stuff, and who's going to take care of the children? Who's going to take care of the home? Well, men can't do that. I wouldn't know how to make a dinner. I wouldn't know how to do the laundry or wash the dishes. I wouldn't know how to take care of a baby, and you certainly wouldn't want to see me try to have one. That wouldn't be very good. That's an image you'd never forget. So here we are. Now, women are going to forget about what needs to be done, forget about taking care of business and staying home. We need to have women at home, not in the voting booth. And it doesn't take a ballot to make a good wife, does it? Us men, we're working hard trying to bring home a wage for our families. And at the end of the day, sometimes we gotta 2 or 3 times a week, maybe more, we gotta go to the tavern to unwind and relax. And that's important. And keep this in mind, these same women that are trying to get on that ballot thing, they're gonna take your taverns away. I don't like that, and that's not a good thing for women either. If I don't go to the tavern and I come home, I'm gonna be cranky, and my wife isn't gonna like that, and women aren't gonna like it. And there's nothing like a good meal at home to lessen my alcoholic cravings. So we got to be careful about this business, even if we're going to lose our taverns too. You know, things have been going fine. We've been making decisions about society and families for years and years. Why are we changing it now? It doesn't make any sense. Why, if my wife went in the voting booth and voted different than me, it wouldn't happen because I wouldn't let her. She'd have to do it in secret. But if she did that, well, it'd cancel my vote out. It wouldn't make any sense at all. We'd go to all that trouble for nothing. So I'm telling you, men, we got a lot to lose here. We got a lot to lose. This is a bad idea. They change this and give women the right to vote, it's going to destroy our society. So you go on and listen to the rest of these women, but you keep in mind what I just told you. It's a bad idea, and don't fall for it. Just remember, mark my words. Remember what I said.
The same remarkable year as Seneca Falls, 1848, Wisconsin became the 30th state. The growing Mississippi River town of La Crosse was incorporated as a city in 1856, the same year that Gideon Hickson arrived. La Crosse would never be the same. The Hickson family's influence in La Crosse was evident well into the next century. Through the lumber industry, financial investments, and the railroad, Gideon and Ellen Hickson were the Carnegies and Rockefellers of the upper Mississippi River Valley. In time, others who supported the civic-minded actions of the Hickson family carried on in their stead. Today, La Crosse is lucky to have the historic Hickson House, Hickson Forest, and the scenic Hickson Trails because of this family of visionaries. The Hickson women were equally as audacious as the Hickson men, as we are about to find out.
Hello, and welcome to one of my favorite places to visit in La Crosse. I am Alice Greene Hickson. Before I tell you anything about me, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the family I married into, the Hicksons. Gideon Hickson moved to La Crosse in 1856, and he partnered with some others to start a lumber company. Well, lumber was very productive. They had timber here and ways to transport the lumber, and so he did very well. He hadn't been here very long, and he met Ellen, and he and Ellen were married. They were still prospering, and they decided to build a home, and they did. They built a home on 7th Street. You might know it now as the Hickson House. While living in that home, they had 5 children, all boys. They continued to prosper, and they became very influential, and they helped a great deal in the development of businesses and the community of La Crosse, and they did that for over 30 years. Well, now a little bit about me. I was born Alice Greene in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. I loved learning, and I was a very studious little girl. I actually was very fortunate and was one of very few women who were able to attend university. So I graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1905. I loved learning, and so I continued to pursue graduate studies at the University of Chicago. I loved learning, and I loved teaching. And so that's what I did. I got a few positions around communities in Wisconsin, and I was eventually invited and hired to teach at the old Central High School here in La Crosse. I loved it. I was teaching English and drama, and that's where I crossed paths with Frank. Now, Frank Hickson was the eldest son of Gideon and Ellen Hickson, and Frank had married, moved to the Twin Cities, and had 2 daughters. But unfortunately, his father, Gideon, passed away. Now, Frank, being very familiar with the family business, was summoned to return to La Crosse to take the helm and the leadership of the family businesses. So he did. He returned. They were doing very well, and he was continuing the family tradition, being community-minded. And unfortunately, his wife, Minnie, passed. And Minnie lies right there under that stone. So now here is Frank, a widow, 2 daughters, grown, but he's very interested and invested in the community. And during some of these interests, he comes across a young teacher named Alice, me. So we met. Now, I had no intention of marrying. I was 38, nearly 40. But I met Frank, and we connected. We hit it off right away. Now, Frank was 20 years my senior, but that didn't seem to matter. And Frank and I fell in love and were married. Well, of course, I quit my teaching job right away, as was customary at that time. So now, here I am with a little bit more free time. I was just delighted at the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And that's the kind of thing I wanted to put my energy into. So what did I do? I founded and became the first president of the La Crosse League of Women Voters. I loved it and felt very good about that. That was 1924. Well, 1925, Frank and I decided to move to be closer to his adult daughters in Lake Forest, Illinois. So I rolled up my sleeves right away, and I founded the Lake Forest League of Women Voters. Well, now, around this time, I was named treasurer of the National League. And then, soon, I was the state of Illinois president of the League of Women Voters. Around that time, I was also appointed to the board of directors of the University of Wisconsin Alumni Association. It was all very exciting. I felt really good about that, but on a day-to-day basis, I could see where women were treated as property, and I could see women and children struggling, and they didn't have a voice. And when I would see these things, I would speak up. And fortunately for me, my husband Frank stood beside me because he had the same belief system that I did. Well, Frank and I continued on, and unfortunately and sadly, Frank passed away at the age of 69, and Frank is buried there next to Minnie. Well, now, here I was, the widow of the eldest son of the Hickson family, and I was given the job of managing the Hickson estate. Now I had the Hickson house. I loved it. It was beautiful, and so I continued to visit every summer. In fact, I was the very last Hickson to ever actually reside in that house. Well, in 1946, right after World War II, a lot of women were needed in the workforce and were training. And so I leased the Hickson house to the La Crosse Vocational School, which you know as Wisconsin Technical College, to be used as a women's dormitory. All of the furnishings were left intact, and I felt so proud to be able to give those women a lovely place where they could study and where they could improve their lives. Well, time went on and I was living in Illinois, and it occurred to me that I really didn't need another house, especially not where in the city I didn't live in. And so in 1962, I donated the house to the Crosse County Historical Society, and they restored it to its original splendor. In fact, many of my personal things are on display there. You could even take a tour. Well, I continued on living, and I lived for another 20 years. And I finally passed at the young age of 99. And I lie on the other side of Frank. I was very, very proud to be able to be a member of the Hickson family. They were generous, and they thought of generations to come. And I am only hoping that they felt as proud of me as I did to be a part of the family. Thank you for visiting me today.
Once the 19th Amendment became effective on August 26, 1920, women flocked to register for the November election. This was especially true in La Crosse, considering there was a primary election in September. The local newspaper took note that women who had registered in large numbers left their housework in the season when canning was at its height. In the 1920 election, it is estimated that 1/3 of the voters was female. By 1922, women were called to sit on juries at the courthouse. Unlike men, they didn't need a reason to excuse themselves from doing so, although, if chosen to serve, showing up late was inexcusable. La Crosse County Circuit Court Judge John Higby admonished prospective jurors,
The alleged traditional habit of the fair sex to be always late, just a few minutes, but nevertheless late, had no standing in the court. Stopping a few minutes to adjust a bonnet was no excuse for not being in court when court opened.
while men were asked not to smoke in the jury room, women were allowed to remove their hats while sitting in the jury box so they would not suffer headaches. The courthouse was one place where women could find employment as a secretary or clerk. The first years after receiving the vote, few women were elected into or even ran for public office. But soon, new doors would be opening.
My name is Esther Domke. I understand you've been hearing lots of women's different stories about their history in La Crosse, maybe a fellow or two as well. Let me just say that 100 years ago, I had no idea how my job would change my life. It all started in the usual way. I was born in 1901, and I graduated from Central High School back when it was in its old place at 16th and Cass. I think there's a lovely park there now, is that right? So then I took a UW Extension course for 3 years in accounting and business administration. And when I was finished, I went to work in the county offices. So let's see, in October of 1923, the deputy county clerk, Olivia Gilbert, resigned to get married. That's what women did in those days. He worked for the railroad, and he was a bit of a baseball star on the local circuit. Anyway, I got her job, and I was only 22 years old. Deputy county clerk. So, I had been the deputy county clerk for nearly 4 years when my supervisor, the county clerk, Hubert Statz, was helping out with a jailbreak at the courthouse. There was a shootout, and Hubert was accidentally killed. When I heard the news, I could hardly believe it. It was such a tragedy. He was so young. Anyway, that was in September of 1927, and I had no choice but to step into Hubert's place as acting county clerk, at least until they could find someone to fill his 2-year term. So in October, the County Board of Supervisors held a special session, and at that time they had 19 applicants. No, 11, I believe. I had no idea about running for the race, but some of my friends and even some of the officials in the courthouse said, well, maybe I should. So a week before the election, I decided to do it. I heard later that there were several secret ballots, and it came down to former city clerk M.R. Birnbaum and me. Well, guess who won? I won. I was the first female office holder in La Crosse County history, and only 7 years after women had finally gotten the right to vote. It was a pretty big deal. I remember being a little bit in shock and also a little bit nervous. And I remember I was too nervous to talk when the newspapers and the radio stations did stories on this historic vote. Well, then we got to work. And as you can imagine, many of the men had a little bit of trouble accepting a woman on the county board. I had to prove myself again and again, but prove myself I did. I never lost an election for 45 years. And I was the La Crosse County Republican Party's first female candidate for any office. No, I never did marry, but I was too busy with my job and my career, and I worked with a lot of offices and a lot of different community organizations. I worked with Lutheran Hospital and the VFW, the American Legion, Viterbo University, the Chamber of Commerce. And I was the first Octoberfest female parade marshal. Did those fuddy-duddies have trouble with that one? Oh my goodness. So, when I finally retired as county clerk in January 1st of 1973, I'd say I signed an average of 700 marriage licenses a year. And I remember saying that I thought a woman should run for county clerk when I retired. Things had definitely changed in those past 50 years. Looking back, it's hard for me to feel that I had an important role in empowering young women, but I have heard otherwise. And perhaps that's why I'm here today. You know, the quiet ones can make a difference too. Thank you for coming to hear my story. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Women roared into the 1920s, continuing to expand their voices and rights. They started running for local, state, and federal offices. Within a decade, women were elected and appointed to higher level positions in business and government. But women still saw inequalities in the American system, both for themselves and others. During the 1930s, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt was a strong role model for women in leadership. She energetically supported women's rights, including for women of color. Gaining ground in the workforce, women took notice of working conditions, labor unions, family and children's welfare, civil rights, and workplace inequality.
miss that train. How lovely! Someone to chat with while I'm waiting for the train. Oh, I should probably introduce myself. My name is Frida Segelke Miller, and I was born right here in La Crosse, April 16th, 1890. Now, unfortunately, by the time I was only 5 years old, my mother had died. And at the age of 13, my sister Elsie and I were left orphans. Luckily for us, our maternal grandparents, Charles and Augusta Segelke, who are buried right over there, chose to raise us. I can tell you as a child, I was always very curious. I loved to learn and I loved going to school. So by 1911, I had graduated Downer College in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and had gone on to graduate studies at the University of Chicago. During those 4 years, I studied economics, sociology, political science, and law. And after 4 years, I got an opportunity for a job. So I left before graduating. 1916 found me in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I was employed by Bryn Mawr College, and I was a social economics teacher and an assistant researcher. The next year, I also took a job at the Philadelphia Women's Trade Union League as the secretary, and I did all 3 of those jobs for 5 years. Now, I cannot tell you how thrilled I was with the women's victory on the Voting Rights Act in 1920. So I decided, why not jump into politics? And so I did. I ran for the House of Representatives for the Farm Labor Party for the great state of Pennsylvania. I didn't win, but I did get over 25,000 votes. This was such a busy and exciting time in my life. I met Pauline Newman, a labor organizer, and we began a lifelong relationship. She was my partner and my very, very best friend. But I will admit, I was somewhat of a passionate and impetuous woman, and I was drawn into an affair with a married man and became pregnant. I can't tell you how difficult it was to be an unwed woman and pregnant in the 1920s. But Pauline came up with a plan to help cover this scandal of mine. We told people we were going to the International Congress of Working Women in Vienna, which we did, but that also when we were abroad, we would be adopting a child. In 1923, my baby was born, a beautiful daughter named Elizabeth. I can tell you she had quite the career and story of her own. But that's probably for another time. Well, when we decided to relocate in the States, we moved to Greenwich Village in New York City. And before long, Pauline got a job as the education director for the International Lady Garment Workers Union, and I got a job as an inspector for the Joint Board of Sanitary Control. Now, through those job connections, we were introduced to Eleanor Roosevelt and Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins was the state industrial commissioner for New York. And I must have impressed her because she hired me several years later to be the director of the Bureau of Women in Industry. And in that job, I was to address minimum wage laws because there was no minimum wage for women and children. So we proposed legislation and it passed in 1933. Now, I can tell you that in 1932, when FDR was elected, do you remember? Frances Perkins was chosen to be his Secretary of Labor. She was the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the United States. Quite an accomplishment. And before long, she appointed me to the International Labor Organization, which was an agency of the League of Nations. And I was traveling even more. So, in 1938, the governor of the state of New York appointed me the state industrial commissioner. Now, keep in mind, this was during the Great Depression. So my charge was to increase employment opportunities and also to implement the state's first unemployment insurance program. People were desperate for jobs. I will tell you that within 1 year of me taking the position, our employment placement increased 50%. The 1940s, I was the special assistant for labor to the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. Oh yes, and I was chosen to be the director of the Bureau of Women in the U.S. Bureau of Women by the retiring director, Mary Anderson. Now, in the 1940s, when the war ended, there was a push to send women back to low-paying jobs. So my charge was to address those inequalities and to find job opportunities and better pay for women. So we did a variety of things. I set up monthly conferences with union women to come in and strategize. And then I encouraged the leadership, contact your legislators about these issues. I came up with some innovative ideas like tie pay rate to job title and end discrimination based on gender. Well, I can tell you we did make progress, but there was still work to be done. My understanding is women, even today, are still not always paid at the same rate as men. So your work is cut out for you, too. In the 1950s, I was again working for the International Labor Organization, traveling the world and evaluating the economic status of women. And I was appointed a delegate to the United Nations for the International Alliance of Women. By the 1960s, Pauline and my relationship really had become strained. We had drifted apart. After all, she was in New York and I was based in Geneva, Switzerland. I was working with the United Nations on children's welfare issues and UNICEF. But when I retired in 1967, at the age of 77, I returned to New York. Oh, it was good to be back, and I was ready to embrace all that was available to me, my relationships and the fun of New York. And I suffered a massive stroke, which severely limited my capabilities. Luckily for me, my cherished Pauline and my blessed daughter Elizabeth chose to care for me. Thank goodness. I died July 21st, 1973, and I'm buried in Manhattan. I'm only here on certain occasions, such as today, but I'm glad to be back. It's wonderful to reconnect with my roots in La Crosse and to pay homage to my wonderful grandparents who raised me to be such a strong and independent woman. Now I challenge all of you, after hearing from all of these people today, all of these women, one must never underestimate the strong will of a woman. Thank you.
The 19th Amendment technically gave all women in the United States the right to vote, but some groups throughout the country still encountered obstacles that kept them from the voting booth. Even after the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, voting rights for black men were restricted through Jim Crow laws. These were unofficial methods used by states, especially in the South, to keep freed slaves from voting. Tactics like poll taxes, literacy tests, moral character tests, proof of property ownership, and grandfather clauses intimidated minority groups. Indigenous people fought a similar battle. After decades of government control and oppression, the 1924 Snyder Act gave full U.S. citizenship to Native Americans. However, they were not given the right to vote in all states until 1962. In August 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, which officially prohibited racial discrimination in voting. This was at the height of the Civil Rights Movement and is considered to be the most effective piece of federal civil rights legislation ever enacted in our country. Suffragist Carrie Chapman Catt recalled the long and difficult journey of the suffrage movement by saying,
"It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended."
She also said, "The vote is a power, a weapon of offense and defense. A prayer. Voting should not be taken for granted or squandered by anyone. The leaders we elect make decisions that affect our daily lives. Elections are our chance to stand up for what matters most to us and to have an impact on the issues that affect us, our communities, our families, and our future.